brief topic is Nietzsche and the beginning of thought in ancient Greece. So, as some of you surely know, Nietzsche is known to us today, of course, as a philosopher, but in his time, he was not so much, at least early on in his career, he was not a philosopher, he was a philologist. He studied and taught ancient Greek and Latin, and that's what much of his early work, at least, was focused on. So when it comes to the beginning of ancient thought in Greece, we're also looking mostly at Nietzsche's early work. There is The Birth of Tragedy, one of his first book that he published as a professor of classics in Basel. But more importantly for the beginning of ancient thought is a book that he never published called Die Philosophie im falschen Zeitalter der Griechen, the philosophy in the tragic age of the Greeks. And this book is about the Pre-Socratics, because when we talk about beginning of thought as far as the West is concerned, we mean ancient Greece, of course, and specifically the Pre-Socratics, the philosophers who were active mostly in the periphery of the Greek world, what is today Western Turkey and southern Italy, and who, many of whom are closer to Nietzsche's own way of thinking than later philosophers like Plato, Aristotle, of course, most famously were. And it's true in general when it comes to Nietzsche's thought and Nietzsche's view of these Pre-Socratics that Plato is sort of public enemy number one, because Plato, there is a turn in the way of thinking with Plato, which Nietzsche very much dislikes, and that's why also he in fact refers to the Pre-Socratics not as the Pre-Socratics, which is what they're known as in the history of philosophy, but rather as a Pre-Platonics, because Nietzsche would hold, I think, justifiably so, that it's really with Plato and not so much with Socrates that things really change in the history of philosophy. So there were many Pre-Socratics. I'm just going to mention a couple of names that were especially important to Nietzsche in this regard and why they were important. What many of the Pre-Socratics have in common is that they are monists, right? So they believe that only matter exists, as opposed to Plato, who is a dualist. Plato believes in matter, the body, and also in the existence of the soul, in metaphysical essence. So Plato is the sort of first major important dualist in philosophy, like Descartes, for example, is a big dualist in modern times. Plato is the most important ancient dualist, and Nietzsche turns against this dualism by embracing the Pre-Socratics and says, well, it's not actually the soul, God, all the metaphysical essences that we know that matter or that exist that are important. Rather, it is matter that matters. And that's why he embraces so many of the Pre-Socratics. For example, I'll mention just a couple of names. Thales. Thales is important also because he is, by sort of common scholarly consent, the first philosopher of the Western canon, who from Western Turkey. Thales said that everything is based on water. Now, a lot of the Pre-Socratics said, especially in the Milesian school, Miletus, which is in southwestern Turkey, said that there is a particular element or substance that is the basis of all things that exist. Now, even though we know that not everything is water, Nietzsche thinks this is very important because it means that everything is one. If you say that everything is water, it means that everything is one. And that means there is only one thing, there is only one substance, and that is matter, that is body. And that, again, that is how Nietzsche distances himself from somebody like Plato, who says, again, that there is body and soul, body and God, body and the essence, Plato's forms, which I'm sure everybody's heard of. Nietzsche says, with Thales, it's not like that. Heraclitus, very important to Nietzsche. Probably, maybe the most important one to Nietzsche of the Pre-Socratics. Heraclitus says everything is fire. But what is especially important about Heraclitus is not the substance that he uses that he decides is the basis of all things. What's important to Heraclitus is that everything is becoming. Heraclitus denies the existence of being. He says that rather everything is becoming. Everything is in the process of becoming its opposite or becoming something else. Black is white, war is peace, sun is rain. We understand everything by studying its opposites. Now, that's important to Nietzsche because if everything is becoming, then things don't have fixed essences. Plato is going to say that there are fixed essences. Again, the Platonic forms, which exist in a higher dimension, those really don't exist. There is only becoming and no being. this is also going to tie in with Nietzsche's perspectivism to some extent later. I'm not going to get into that so much, but Nietzsche is famous for perspectivism. Something is true because I believe it to be true. The process of becoming plays into that to some extent. If nothing is fixed, if there are no fixed essences, truth becomes a little more malleable. But again, that's a whole other topic. But the fact that everything is becoming is important for Nietzsche's rejection of dualism. If there is no metaphysical soul, if there is no God, we think of soul, we think of God, we think of perfect essences as being fixed. Right? When we see a tree, Plato would say, well, the tree is a manifestation of tree-ness, which is something fixed and essential. If everything is becoming, there is no such thing as the perfect or ultimate tree. There is no such thing as the ultimate God, as the ultimate soul. Everything is physical becoming. That's why Heraclitus is enormously important for Nietzsche. Nietzsche, of course, is going to criticize religion like Christianity, especially in his later work, and the denial of dualism and the embrace only of matter is going to be very important for him in that regard. I'll mention two more Pre-Socratics briefly before finishing. Parmenides, who comes a little later. Parmenides is important because he actually takes a step toward Plato in the development of philosophy, because Parmenides de-emphasizes empiricism and emphasizes rationalism. That is to say, we know the truth of things not by observing them, we know the truth of things simply by reason, by thinking about them, and that's going to be very much in the line of Plato. Later on, Heraclitus had based his conclusions much more on empiricism, on observation, and on sort of just his own intuition, which is going to be very much in line with Nietzsche's own thinking. For those of you who have read Nietzsche, I'm sure many of you, you know that Nietzsche is often not so much, it depends on the work, but often not so much at pains with explaining painstakingly, argument by argument, how he reaches a certain conclusion. Rather, Nietzsche just sort of blurs it out, whatever he thinks, because it's based on his own mere observation and on his intuition. And Heraclitus is sort of like that. Parmenides is going to say, empiricism doesn't matter, our observation doesn't matter, the truth is only what we reason it to be. And that's why Nietzsche dislikes Parmenides and considers him to be a step toward Plato. But the final pre-Socratic philosopher, which Nietzsche discusses in this incomplete work, the philosophy in the tragic age of the Greeks that I mentioned, is Anaxagoras. Anaxagoras again returns to the importance of becoming as opposed to being, and Anaxagoras also doesn't reject empiricism, but he says that, he doesn't reject rationalism completely, but Anaxagoras states that empiricism, intuition, is just as important in arriving at the truth, as Nietzsche would say. Anaxagoras famously posits something called the nous, mind, which is a sort of supernatural. I don't want to say supernatural because that brings us in the direction of metaphysics, but it is sort of the ultimate mind that controls the universe. But what's important, we could call it intellect or reason. What's important about this nous is that it is not moral. It is purely aesthetic. And this is where we get to what Nietzsche said in The Birth of Tragedy, which he had published the year before, in 1872, which is a very famous line of Nietzsche's, that it is only as an aesthetic phenomenon that existence and the world are justified. What Nietzsche means by that, many people have commented on this famous sentence, but what he means by this is that the world has no teleology. We are not here for any particular reason. There's no ultimate purpose. There is no morality that God has established and given to all of us. Rather, it is only because things are beautiful, because the cosmos is a thing that is awesome to behold. And that is the only justification. That is the only way we can make sense of why we're here, of why we're alive. And this is going to upset Plato very much. He will reject Anaxagoras for this reason. He will say that, well, you can't posit something, you can't posit a cosmos without making everything logical, without making everything rational and moral and good. It is blasphemous against God to say that there is some part of the universe that is not directed toward goodness. So that's why Nietzsche dislikes Plato. That's why he embraces the Pre-Socratics. mainly because the pre-Socratic view is the material view and the aesthetic view of the world. And I think those two elements are what is going to later on inform so much of Nietzsche's other thinking. His argument against Christianity, his perspectivism, his rejection of free will, and many other things like that. So even though he speaks more about the Pre-Socratics directly early in his work, the importance of these pre-Socratic ideas are going to continue to flow through so much of the rest of his work, I think, for the rest of his entire writing career. And that's what I'd like to say about Nietzsche and the beginning of thought in ancient Greece.
Thank you, Benedict. Together, all right, okay. So, just one question or maybe comment I have is Nietzsche has a close affinity to Pre-Socratics for the reasons that you listed, but there's several other things, but one other thing is also their style. They wrote poetically. I mean,
right.
Many of the Pre-Socratics they were poets like
yes.
Empedocles and Parmenides. So they wrote, although Nietzsche doesn't like Parmenides, but let's not get into that. I'm not sure if Nietzsche is right about him, but anyway, that's in between parentheses.
Yes.
But they were poets, most of them. So do you think that's also an element?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I touched upon briefly. Now, the problem is a lot of the pre-Socratic work, the overwhelming majority of it is not extant. So we don't, in most cases, we don't know exactly how they wrote. But it's true. Nietzsche also comes. Xenophanes is another name that's worth mentioning.
Right.
That he talks about Xenophanes specifically for this reason, saying he wrote in a poetic way. And there's similar statements about Heraclitus. But as I alluded to briefly, Heraclitus bases his, as far as we can see from his work Periphysios on nature, seems to, as opposed to Parmenides, at least to some extent, seems to base his conclusions. It seems to write in a similar way. You could almost say as Nietzsche.
Right.
I mean, if you've read the fragments of Heraclitus, obviously, and Nietzsche, you can see certain similarities. Style and content are met, and I think which is very true of Nietzsche himself. And the fact that Heraclitus builds a cosmos that is meant to be mainly aesthetic, and that he presents it in an aesthetic way, I think, almost poetic way. I think, that's
that also relates to your
reason.
point about aesthetics with the Pre-Socratics, poetics.
Right. Exactly.
That cannot really underestimate it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so.
Because as you move into philosophy, philosophers they forget the poetic origin of doing philosophy.
And those who don't forget it get to suffer from it from the
yes. Any questions? Please, and also please speak loudly. There's also New York City noise in the background, so we need to speak louder. Yes.
What do you mean by the distinction that they were poetic?
They.
As opposed to prosaic.
Go ahead.
As opposed to prosaic, I think that's a decent way of putting it. I mean, it's a very subjective statement, but it applies. For example, it implies. Sometimes it's just that poetics, what we might quote unquote poetic, that it's written in a beautiful way. But Xenophanes, for example, is an example who wrote actual poetry. I mean, it's strictly in poetic format. And so the philosophy is presented as a poem. And that's true of a lot of ancient philosophers, not just the Pre-Socratics.
So do you mean that it has a musical element?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And you find that later too. I mean, he criticizes the Stoics a lot, for example, but I always thought Nietzsche is closer to the Stoics than he himself seems to be aware of. But for example, Cleanthes, the second Stoic of the second leader of the Stoic school, wrote the text we have from him is a hymn to Zeus, which is a presentation of his philosophy, but it's all strictly in poetic format. So the later on we get in history, the more and more they write prose, but it's true for especially the early Greeks, but some later ones that they do present their thoughts actually as poems.
So they thought that writing poetically elevated.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and in the beginning, I mean, writing in general, as you may know, is usually poetry. Right? Poetry in most civilizations comes before prose because early in a civilization, most people can't write, and so writing is considered something very special, almost sacred. And so if you're going to write, then it's natural to them that you would do it in the most elevated way and not in a prosaic way. It would be shocking to the very earliest writers writing in poetry to see something written in the style in which we speak with each other, for example. So, so that's what
I think too that the aesthetic is synonymous with the experience of the body, total body,
Yeah.
as and giving expression in that way versus mental.
Right. No, yeah.
And that ties into what you were saying about his materialism and his physicalism.
Yeah.
So that the aesthetic is synonymous with physicality.
Mm-hmm.
The
Yeah.
physical expression is drive-based.
Yes. Yeah. And of course, you would have some more metaphysically minded people who would argue, of course, that their point of view is just as aesthetic, if not more so. But personally, I happen to agree with your point of view. Yeah. Yeah. I don't. Yeah. Which is why I don't think I have anything to add to it. But I think you're right.
It's
Yeah.
synonymous with physicality.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. No, I think that's true.
That also goes really to another core subject in Nietzsche, the role of the body.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is big. That's why he also goes back to ancient Greeks,
Yeah.
because they were not repressed the way we are.
Actually,
About the
yeah,
body.
that reminds me.
I mean,
yeah.
repression.
Right.
Repression
Yeah,
comes from two things for Nietzsche. One, the civilizing process. The
Right.
other one is from our religions. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are very repressive regarding the body.
Sure.
So, but there's also the civilizing process also represses the body.
Yeah.
Greeks see things that they're more open about the bodily expressions,
Indeed.
and also sexuality.
Yeah, no, for sure. Although they have their own taboos as well. Actually, what you said reminds me, he even says, he compares the cosmos constructed by Anaxagoras with a sculpture of Phidias, actually.
Right,
So
right.
that's, yeah,
Yeah.
that goes exactly to the point. Yeah.
Any other questions, thoughts, comments? If not, we'll thank Benedict again and thank you.